Hello, my name's Karina Evangelista, and I'm the Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Oklahoma Contemporary Arts Center. To mark the National Poetry Month, we have invited Robert Montgomery to speak about his light poem, The Stars Pulled Down for Real, currently installed here, and the last work to remain on view from Bright Golden Haze, the inaugural exhibition for a new building. Illuminated with LED lights, the poem is an adaptation of Ezra Pound's tribute to the dazzling lights of New York City. If a haunting subversion of Pound's text, Montgomery's version clings to the possibility of transcendence, the power of keeping faith, of remembering the map under the flood water, turning poetry into secular prayer. He has referred to his practice of addressing the cityscape as an exercise in remembering the magic of the city, to uncover the sacred in the everyday or a sense of God in the mundane. Robert speaks to the poet Raymond Antrobus about the intersection of visual art and poetry, about the power structures of language. Raymond will also read from his book, The Perseverance, in which he had written, "So maybe I belong to the universe underwater, where all the songs are smeared with the wailings for Salacia, the goddess of salt water, healer of infected ears." Robert and Raymond tackle the concept of rewriting as the art of writing and acknowledge that the very passage of time can rewrite text. Raymond Antrobus was born in London to an English mother and Jamaican father. He is a Cave Canem Fellow and author of The Perseverance and All the Names Given, published by Tin House. His first children's picture book, Can Bears Ski, illustrated by Polly Dunbar, is published by Candlewick Press. His work has been featured on NPR, BBC, The Guardian, Lit Hub, Poetry Magazine, among others. His accolades include a Ted Hughes Award, University of Warwick Young Writer of the Year Award, and the Rathbone Folio Prize. He is currently based in Oklahoma City, but wherever he is, he listens as an investigator of missing sounds. Robert Montgomery's text-based work plies the nexus between conceptual art and poetry. He first began installing his light poem installations with messages that stood out in a panorama of consumerist ads in Shoreditch, a district in the East End of London, in 2004. Putting a literal spin on concrete poetry, he sees city blocks as concrete poems, with each urban intervention as a page. He has exhibited at the Venice Biennale in 2011 and represented the United Kingdom at the first biennial exhibition in India in 2012. He lives and works in London, adhering to the conviction that the point of art is to touch the hearts of strangers.
Hello Robert, I'm outside Oklahoma Contemporary, standing in front of your billboard, The Stars Pulled Down for Real. And I'm looking forward to this conversation with you where we can talk about, where our two disciplines intersect, mine being poetry, yours being kind of text-based visual art. I'm looking forward to keeping that kind of conversation going between us. Robert, hello.
Hey Ray, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I was just wondering, because as a poet, the words kind of evoked so much for me, including quite a few other poets. I thought we'd just start there with the text, and then we'll also talk about the kind of concept.
Sure. The light piece, or the light billboard, the text says, "Squares and squares of flame with memory inside them, remembering the map under the floodwater, twist up the heart songs of the dead into empty stadiums, and all the stars pulled down now for real." a subversion or a rewriting of a text by Ezra Pound. And the context of the work, it was made in 2015, I think, in Seattle. And yeah, so that line from the Light piece that says, "Twist up the heart songs of the dead into empty stadiums," was partly being in Seattle. I had an image, for some reason, of like Nirvana songs playing in an empty stadium. The stadium that I saw was the Houston Astrodome, where I lived in Houston for a time, and I suddenly, the empty city lot made me think of empty stadiums, and I thought of Nirvana because I was in Seattle. And but I guess that line of that piece, with the heart songs of the dead into empty stadiums, is a line that has resonance. Stadiums have been empty for a year now in most parts of the world, and a time of strange emptiness in terms of civic space and public space, and it's strange. And it was a commission for public art in what was an empty city lot at that point, an empty city block in downtown Seattle, which belonged to the Seattle Light and Power Company. And given the site and location, it made me think about the electric city. And so I was pondering that question of the electric city and what would be the electric city after the age of ecological crisis. Could we conceive of a post-electric city? Could we conceive of a post-carbon city? And so, like I often do, I went back to look at poets writing 100 years ago in the 1910s, because I often take a lot of inspiration from that period of poetry, because it's sort of the beginning of modernist poetry, right? And I find that just formally really interesting. And so I was reading a book by Gabriel Garcia Lorca, poet in New York, and I thought I would find something there that was about the city in the 19-teens. But actually, I came across this text by Pound, which was written, I think, in 1912 for a magazine called The New Age, a sort of journal called The New Age, and then lost and not published. I think it was, he sent the text to Poetry magazine and they lost it, and it was discovered and published in 1950. But it was his description of New York in 1912. Now the key thing here is that New York was the first electric city, really. And I sort of discovered that by reading a background book to the writing of The Great Gatsby, and they were talking about New York having the first traffic lights, the first roads, and the first towers of electric light. And Pound says this, he says, "And New York is the most beautiful city in the world. It's not far from it. No urban nights are like the night here. I have looked down across the city from high windows. It is then that the great buildings lose reality and take on their magical powers. They are immaterial. That is to say, one sees but the lighted windows, squares and squares of flame set and cut into the ether. Here is our poetry, for we have pulled down the stars to do our will." And that phrase, "we have pulled down the stars to do our will," seemed to crystallize for me our attitude to nature in the 20th century. We thought we could control nature, consume nature, make it do our bidding. And what we're discovering at the beginning of the 21st century is that that's not true. We cannot make nature do our will. We have to get back in sync with nature. So it seemed to me a text really of its time, and I wanted to try to rewrite that text in some way for this time when we know the way we are living is destroying the planet, right? So how do you rewrite that for the age of ecological crisis, really? And that was the brief I gave myself, and I ended up with the text we have.
Yeah, no, that's great. That makes sense, because there was so many poets that have kind of gone to New York and had that moment of almost the moment of witnessing the spectacle of this electric city. And so, yeah, I was thinking about, not just Ezra Pound, and you mentioned Federico Garcia Lorca. I was also thinking of a Russian poet called Vladimir Mayakovsky, who also went to New York around the same time. And then a bit later on, Jimenez, who's a Spanish poet. So it's kind of interesting how many poets ended up in that kind of location in the late 19th century and had that same kind of ecstatic moment, the poet's ecstatic moment, right? In fact, like there was a poem by Rilke that when I first read your billboard, it made me think of it straight away. It was like, oh yes. I'm just gonna read a few lines from it. Rilke says, "If you are the dreamer, I am what you dream. But when you want to wake, I am your wish, and I grow strong with all magnificence and turn myself into a star's vast silence above the strange and distant city, time." And so I love that how you have found a way as a poet, not just using text, but also using your art. And I love how, the idea of the landscape comes in to your work and your text. And is there any more that you could say about how a text kind of changes depending on the time and the place and the landscape? So I know that this The Stars Being Pulled Down for Real has been, like you said, to other places. Like you talk about Seattle. Does all of your work do that? Like in the sense of it, you're thinking about where it's been exhibited, who's reading it, as well as just like having a conversation with the environment as well.
That's interesting. I mean, your first point on the question of landscape and bringing the idea of landscape into the city, I think is something that I'm really conscious of. In a lot of my billboard work, there is this sense of the city being landscape, and sort of that's quite an important thing for me, sort of as a writer, as a thinker. I mean, I think of the city as a living landscape. We sort of think of, weirdly, we think of cities as the built environment. We think of the built environment as something that's not natural, right?
Yeah.
However, we think of beehives as nature. And what are our cities but our beehives, right? So I think cities are the beehives of humans. So when you begin to think of cities as part of the natural world, the beehives of humans, if you will, then that gives us sort of clues and cues to how we might think about reconfiguring cities from an architectural and town planning point of view for a future which has to be more sustainable, more ecological, and more in tune with nature, right? So that basic trying to understand the city as part of the natural world is like a step towards that ecology or ecological imagination, I think. And obviously I'm not the best at that. I'm not an architect or town planner, but I can sort of dream that space in a way. Then the question of the context, well, I mean, that's an interesting question that Walter Benjamin would have lots to say on. Does the moving a painting change its meaning? Well, possibly. I think that the work that's about cities, I tend to write about the city as an archetype, and the city as a phenomenon, and by that token, they could sort of exist anywhere, and they're talking about the archetypal city in a way. I loved what you said about the Rilke poem being seeing the city and then seeing the great sky above, and that juxtaposition of urban life and the sort of being awestruck by nature. That's really, really interesting. And weirdly, I remembered actually when I went back and looked at the original Pound poem the other day, which I hadn't, or Pound prose actually, which I hadn't done for a while, I realized that what might have attracted me to that text is the phrase high windows. I have looked down across the room, high windows, because when I was a kid, when I was 12 years old, I fell in love with this poem by Philip Larkin called High Windows. And it ends, rather than words come the thought of high windows, the sun comprehending glass, and beyond it the blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless, and that kind of transcendent, exactly that transcendent moment, the moment when you realize that you're, this tiny part of nature, and the sky arrives newly with its presence, and you think, whoa, shit, we're here, we're alive. That sort of that new thrilledness in being alive that poetry at its best can bring. I think that's the thing, isn't it? That's what we go to poetry for, and that's what poetry can do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love that. So even within the text, you're already thinking about all of these other poems and poets, and so that kind of makes me think about, your process of writing. And there's a quote that I love that says something like, there's no such thing as writing, only rewriting.
Yeah.
And is that something, that you could speak to in a way, in this idea of kind of rewriting something, and how you make it your own,
Not only in this case, because I was taking an existing text by Ezra Pound and trying to subvert that and give it, change it for our time, which is the time of ecological crisis and a time of, when we've lived through the sort of what James Howard Kunstler would call the brief party of the oil age, right? So 90 when we start to use up oil, and now we've used up 2/3 of it, and we spent it very quickly, but it's only been 100 years of our world. So, what is beyond that? What's beyond that way of living? And I've been really affected in the way I write, I think, by my love of Philip Larkin, Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath and John Ashbery. Because I studied painting. I mean, you're the real poet in this conversation, right? So you're the real poet. I'm just a painter who does things with words, right? So I studied painting at Edinburgh College of Art, and I loved Jenny Holzer when I was a student. I thought her work was incredible. I loved the way it intervened in the city, and she was my hero. And then I kind of tried I just loved poetry. I didn't study it, but I would spend a lot of time in the university library reading Sylvia Plath and John Ashbery, whose poem So Many Lives I really love. And it was my private passion. So I then tried every single way I could think of making visual art and poetry go together. And for decades, none of those worked. I must have tried every way that didn't work to put together visual art and poetry. And it was only through failing in lots of different forums that I finally found a way that kind of worked, that kind of is contemporary art and kind of is poetry. And I'm never quite sure, and I'm interested in a way in my work sitting in the sort of awkward place between contemporary art and poetry, and sort of like what happens on that margin, what is in that space that is not like hasn't quite been done yet or something, or like what is in that space,
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I guess I was thinking as well about how in some of your other work, you've got these fire poems, and you've got the text, and then you set fire to it, and then you've got the light poems, and then you've got these poster poems. So there's like different material that you're using in different poems. And I was curious, how were you deciding, what words to light on fire, what words to illuminate, and what to just put on the wall in a poster?
Yeah, I mean, well, the original Billboard poems that I started in 2004, they were sort of like, I started doing those because I was really involved in the Stop the War Coalition, which was a sort of peace protest movement against the Second Iraq War, and there was a big demonstration in London in 2013, the February, the February of 2003, and I took part in that, and it felt like a really beautiful, inspiring moment of 1 million people marching for peace, and it seemed like it might change what would happen. And then the war happened anyway, and I got really depressed. I found myself personally depressed because the war happened anyway, right? So my response to that was to write initially peace poems and put them up inside bus stop advertising spaces. The first one I wrote said, when we are sleeping, aeroplanes carry memories of the horrors we have given our silent consent to into the night sky of our cities, and leave them there to gather like clouds and condense into our dreams before morning, which is kind of how I felt about that war. And then I sort of went from there really, and then I started doing bigger billboards and writing longer things. What I wanted to investigate really was this idea. Well, the city's dominated by billboards and by a certain type of speech, right? And I think that type of speech is the type of speech of advertising. The dominant languages of our society really are the language of advertising and the language of news media. And the significant, what those two dominant languages have in common is they're entirely materialist. They only treat the outside, they only deal with their material life, right? So advertising treats us as a consumer. The language of news media treats us as, a voter, a demographic, a vote, but they focus entirely on the material world for the large part, and those dominate urban space and they dominate digital space in a way too. So I wanted to see what would happen if you took almost like a heartbroken language and put it on billboards, a language that was really intimate, that was sometimes heartbroken, that was like, and sometimes I change the voice. Like the voice is not always my voice or what I think. It's things that I feel are in the emotional air or something. So sometimes it would be about an anti-war message or an ecology message, or sometimes it would be a first person or second person address to someone who I'm speaking to, or the text is speaking to, as if they were a lover, and there's a really intimate vulnerability to the voice. And so I was really interested in taking that vulnerability of voice, I think, and putting it on those billboards where you're used to like a very different tone of voice.
Yeah, so that's interesting what you're saying there about voice, because as a poet, people might often assume that the voice of the poems that we write or that we are showcasing are always, it's always us, right? It's always Robert, it's always Raymond. How do you...
Oddly not like that, is it, in a way? It's like,
no, exactly.
How do you, I don't know how you differentiate that for the audience. But it's like, but I feel like, our job is to like tune into the collective unconscious and write from there.
Yeah.
It's like, an art form of many voices, and like, sort of. But for me, the thing about poetry, the essential thing about poetry as a type of speech, as a language, is that it's a way to reconcile, the heartbroken child inside of you with the world as it is outside of you. So it's a language of therapy, and for me, and a language of, it does for me what religion does for some people. It's a kind of meditative, redemptive, spiritual space where like things can be forgiven, I can be forgiven, the world can be sort of set to some sort of balance or quietness. I really fell in love with your book again this week, because I was reading The Perseverance, and which is a really good book that everyone tuning in must read if they haven't already. And I thought that, and I read something in an interview with you where you just talked about writing yourself into that sort of quietness, or that quiet state. And that seemed something that I really connected with.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I was wondering if we could have a look at the at some other light poems. So you've got this light poem that I love, that I really resonated with, where it says, "All palaces are temporary palaces." Right? Yeah. And I think one of the things that kind of struck me with that poem is that it was kind of, we were talking about landscape, we're talking about environment, as well as kind of content and language, physical language. And I just imagined if I was there, it's an empty swimming pool, and we're kind of situated in, staring at the text in an empty swimming pool, and I imagine how sound would be from, if we were there, and it's this echoey, ethereal sound, all of these kind of echoes, and then even the word palace. So like I've got like it basically reminded me of the first poem in the Perseverance, which on the page is a kind of pillar of language in itself. And the context of this was actually, I wrote this while I was in a kind of palace, but a cathedral, as it were, Gaudi's cathedral in Barcelona, and how he had designed so much of his buildings around this idea of how to contain holy sound, right? And what holy sound is. And my grandfather was a preacher. As a kid, I would go to his church and I'd never hear anything. I just sat there completely kind of lost in all of the sound in this very echoey space. But then there's also something about it that's kind of trying to reach further, trying to pierce another realm at the same time. Anyway, I've got these hearing aids, and I kind of personify the hearing aids in this poem, and I say, my ear amps whistle as if singing to echo, goddess of noise, the raveled knot of tongues, of blaring birds, consonant crumbs, of dull doorbells, sounds swamped in my misty hearing aid tubes. Gaudi believed in holy sound and built a cathedral to contain it, pulling hearing men from their knees as though deafness is a kind of atheism. Who would turn down God? Even though I have not heard the golden decibel of angels, I have been living in a noiseless palace with a doorbell as pulsating light, and I am able to answer. And so there's a real kind of sonic quality in your work. And I love that it's also about, like we're talking about the environment too.
I love that poem. That's really powerful. That's interesting to hear because also I always thought I became a billboard poet because I hated reading poetry out loud so much.
That's
so nervous.
I
was always too nervous to ever become like a spoken word poet, like I'd do spoken word acts and I'd be like, shit, I don't want to sing anything. and then so I hated reading my text out loud so much that I found like a completely different way of making it in the world, but a silent way where it was still like there in the world,
Oh wow, yeah.
When I self-analyze, I think there's quite a lot of truth in that. But that's really interesting. My grandfather was a preacher too. That's weird.
Huh.
My grandparents started their own like Pentecostal church in Scotland when they were coal miners, and they started their own like little tiny church. Still exists, little tin church.
Interesting.
In my part of Scotland. Very interesting.
But there should be a whole genre of like grandchildren. The grandchildren of preachers.
It is quite weird. Interesting connection.
And you have another light poem which I wanted to talk about called the slow disappearance of meaning and truth.
That's a really simple piece in a way. That's again a hijacking and a subversion of meaning of a form. So the form of that piece is exactly the form of the Las Vegas city limit sign that says, welcome to fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada, that diamond sign on the strip or the edge of town or whatever. And I wanted to that again was during the beginning of the Second Iraq War and being involved in trying to stop the war and those protests and that peace movement, and then the idea that the war was started on a basis that was not based on fact, and it wasn't honest. But then, of course, it has further reflections when we get to the age of Trumpism, where truth went out the window even more.
Mm.
Yeah, that idea of détournement or subversion of taking a cultural object and subverting its meaning comes from situationists, thinkers like Guy Debord, and painters like Asger Jorn, who would take these old paintings and paint on top of them sort of comedic contortions. So it's like the tournement means to take a sign or symbol, hijack and change its meaning and take it on a detour. A lot of that stuff about signs and symbols and their meanings came from my reading of Roland Barthes and Jean Baudrillard in art school, you know? Like the way that they were interested in deconstructing, you know, types of speech is a term for Roland Barthes, really, and you know, all of those, the power structures of language, I guess, and the structures of language.
A really striking line here. The people you love become ghosts inside of you, and like this, you keep them alive.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really personal piece. That's like my most well-known work. I wrote it when my best friend from art school died. He was called Sean Flynn, and he was my best friend. And we met at the end of art school, and we were like, you know, Batman and Robin. We lived like when I went to do the core program in Houston at the MFA, he came with me, lived in Houston. When I came back to London, he moved back. He lived like in my same building as me, and he got hit by a car and died in 2004. So I wrote that piece about him, and I was with him when he died, and that was the first experience of grief in my adult life. But it was also first time I was with someone who I loved who was dying, and it was really strange and difficult, obviously. But the interesting thing is that as he was dying, I was holding his hand and I was trying to push as much love into him as I could, as fast as I could, and I could feel him doing the same thing, and I could feel him pushing his love back into my hand. And I sat with him for a while after the doctor said he was gone, but I could still, even when he was dead, feel him pushing that energy back into me physically. And it was a really interesting thing to discover, that I could still feel that tangible love coming into me as a physical thing from someone I loved who was dead. And that was like, you know, there is kind of proof in the Newtonian universe that love is stronger than death, that love survives beyond death, like that love is, you know, that someone who's gone is still physically loving you in a way that you can feel in the physical world. That's like, well, that's that question that our grandparents were asking, right, when they were preachers, or they were searching for that, like, is love bigger than death? Is there?
Yeah, I thought there was a really powerful kind of significance of that as well, to, you know, a lot of people who would relate to a loss in this time. You know, I've got a few friends who, well, I myself have lost a friend in COVID, and a family member, and quite a few of my friends as well have lost like parents and family members as well. So this, I mean, there was a kind of very visceral kind of comfort in coming across that light poem about the ghost inside that keeps them, you know, they're still with you, we still carry them with us. And I wrote this poem, I lost my dad a few years ago, and it kind of made me think of this as well, about this, I had this tape that my dad made of me speaking when I was a kid, and I found it while I was cleaning out his flat, and I even got the tape tattooed on my arm. And this poem goes: the day I clear out my dead father's flat, I throw away boxes of molding LPs, Garvey, Malcolm X, Mandela, speeches on vinyl. I find a TDK cassette tape on the shelf. The smudge green label reads Raymond speaking. I play the tape in his vintage cassette player and hear my 2-year-old voice chanting my name, Antrop, and Dad's laughter crackling in the background, not knowing I couldn't hear the word bus and wouldn't until I got my hearing aids. Now I sit here listening to the space of deafness. Antrop, Antrop, Antrop. So there's this kind of, you know, wailing, this kind of, despite the pain which is with you, there's still a need to almost throw it back into the universe, you know, and throw it out. And
interestingly, At the end of that poem, Antrob really sounds like a heartbeat.
Exactly, yeah.
I have a son who doesn't speak. He has autism and he's non-verbal pretty much. But our sort of and we were very physically close. And the heartbeat thing is like, I lie in bed and listen to his heartbeat. There's a real intimacy between parents and children with heartbeat, I think, and mothers will identify with. I mean, with that, I'm sure it's really like that basic connection, isn't it? It's strange, and it's I love the poems about your dad. I mean, the one that you wrote about him being in a chicken shop and his heart falling out.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that broke my heart, actually. I felt that was, what is that one? His heart turned against him in a chicken shop. He said, "My heart is falling out." And he slipped into his dreams of his mother in Jamaica. It's a really beautiful poem, and it's in really simple language, and it made me think of Raymond Carver. Have you read his short story?
Yeah,
And
yeah, absolutely.
he used this really pared back style, and then he would just say something like really simple, but it will break your heart. Like he would just say, she took the teacup and she placed it on the shelf, and your heart will break somehow because he's got such an emotional tension in a very minimal style. It's just really clever, and it really reminded me of that.
Yeah, I remember I was given. I actually read Raymond Carver's poetry before I read his short stories, and I was just given. It was a present. I can't remember who from, maybe a friend or someone, but years ago. And I remember reading it and just being like, "Oh, you can do this in poetry. You can just be this straight, this minimal. You can just speak to one person." So in a way that like maybe Rilke or Lorca or Ezra Pound feels like if they have a direction of where they're looking, it seems to be in the sky. But I think if Raymond Carver had a direction, it's either straight ahead or at the ground. It's very kind of earthly. It's here, it's tethered.
That's really interesting. And he's not like addressing a vast auditorium. He's addressing like like really modern and intimate. Tess Gallagher is also like, his wife's also a really good poet.
Of course, yeah.
That she wrote after Raymond died. That's like that's about grief in a really beautiful way. Also, we're talking about grief for an hour.
Yeah.
You think this is why people tuned into this broadcast, to hear it too? But not to get too caught up in grief. But I think that poetry is a great tool for healing in grief. I think.
In fact, speaking of healing, I want to ask you about your most recent text-based work, the NHS work. We try our very best. We love for NHS. So for people who might not know what NHS is, it stands for National Health Service. It's free healthcare. It's basically, I don't know, in America, that doesn't seem to be happening yet. But I think we can both vouch. We're both huge fans and admirers and appreciators of NHS and everything it stands for. As people who benefited from it, been born to it and through it. So yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to how your work is honouring the NHS.
I mean, that was a piece I did. That was like a piece I did at the beginning of lockdown last March, a year ago almost, and it was it's like a street poster in 4 parts. The first part says, "A quiet prayer holds over London. The trees become our citizens and guardians in the wind. The trees hold their own silent riot in our honour. We are stopped to appreciate the people who care for us. A tender percussion orchestra of applause joins the country, a fairy light net of kindness. We try our best, we love our NHS." close in the sky above. You will hear the pounding horses of love. We try our very best. We love our NHS. It's like, it was almost like trying to make like a chant of appreciation in a way for doctors, nurses, care workers, frontline workers dealing with the pandemic. It was also a response to being in London and London stopping in the city, going silent, and that strange thing that suddenly the sound of the birds seemed huge. Like it was like someone turned the volume of the birds up to like 20, and I was like, shit, the birds sound really loud. And I realized that there's no traffic. The streets were silent, and the birds are always there making that sound, but you never hear it. And then it was sort of the sound of the wind in the trees. And I did a painting of a text from that poem that says, "When we are gone, the trees will riot." I think in that piece I wrote, in the wind, the trees hold their own silent riot in our honor. The idea of the trees having a silent riot for the people who were dying at that point, which was, I guess, one of the most fatal parts of the pandemic in England. And yeah, and it, that sound of the wind in the trees, that transcendent sound.
Yeah, you're like it's like a social justice poet as well as a eco poet. And I guess, in fact, I've heard the term recently, eco justice. I think that something that you could probably call your poetry, eco justice, concrete poetry.
I mean, there's a lot of people doing more than me for campaigning for eco-justice and social justice and racial justice and all the causes of today that are really important. I mean, I guess as artists and poets, we need to just lend our support to those great struggles,